to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a direct comparison between Ilford Delta 100 and Ilford Fp4. You might think they're pretty similar, I mean around 100 speed, black and white, made by Ilford, but there are little differences. There are different grain structures, the slight speed difference, but really it's just the difference in the age of the emulsion. Fp4 has gone for a few different iterations, but it's a little bit more classic. I think they call it a classic grain structure. Delta 100 is more modern in it's a T grain, although Ilford's literature does insist it's not the same as what Kodak do with T-Max and such. Today I'm going to be using two film backs on the same camera, and I'll use a tripod. I'll set up my shot, I'll meter my shot, and then I'll take the two different exposures with the same scene, and I'll do film A, film B, maybe for a first couple of ones, and then I'll reveal what they are, and we can talk about whether one's better, whether one's worse, whether one's more suited for certain uses, and hopefully you can, next time you choose between the two films, do so with a little bit more confidence. Okay, so I made it to the cliff. It's a little bit windy, but you should be able to hear me. And I have here the two film backs I'm going to use. So what I'm going to do now is just put one of each into both of these. It doesn't matter too much which goes where, because to be honest, I'm probably going to shoot them both at the same film speeds. Because this camera I'm using only has half stops, and that's only on the aperture, I'm not going to be able to do a third of a stop for that 25 ISO. I will meter it differently, but on the whole they're going to be pretty similar. What I'm going to do is just give these a few winds, because I want to make sure that they're fully finished. Let's see which one this is. Okay, this is a roll of HP5. I've just burnt through this roll as quickly as I can with the cliffs behind me. It is a spectacular view, but I'm not here to shoot HP5. I'm here to shoot the ones for the video. So there's one, and I'll load this one. That's the black back. I'll put the black box in there, maybe that'll help me remember. Okay, that took a little bit longer than expected, but I've got these both loaded now. I'm just going to wind this one onto the one, just throw that out the way. Okay, so that's a loaded back, and that camera's ready to go. I guess I got to go look for my first composition. Okay, so this is the light meter I'm using, and I'm getting a reading of about halfway between F8 and F11. When I give it just any direction that has both sky and water in it, it's about the same. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and follow it as accurately as possible for each of the films. So for this, I'm getting a reading of a 30th of a second at f8.5 at 100 ISO. If I just bump my ISO up to 125, for the Fp4, I don't think it's going to take me to F11, but F8.9, I might in fact do that at F11 then. Okay, so this is going to be the first shot. It's a nice shot out across the bay, across the rocks, and I'm going to take this shot at f8.5 for the Delta and at f11 for the Fp4. Let's have a look how these look. So this is how I'm going to show the films. I will keep them anonymous, just film A and film B for at least the first 3 or 4. Now, the reason I'm doing that is so you don't have any preconceptions, you don't just jump to the film you prefer more. And just a note on my scanning technique, I've kept them as linear and as equal as I can. Any adjustment that I've made to the Delta version, I've also applied to the Fp4 version, and in that way, they're going to be as equal and as representative of how you would get the film if you just got the lab to scan it. This is probably close to how they'd look. I'm not saying this is how I'd edit them myself. Obviously, if I do adjust the contrast, it's not really fair as a comparison, but if you follow along, it should become clear which film has which characteristics, and it might be easier to pick the one you prefer if you can see them both right next to each other, as I've shown them like this. Okay, I've taken my first shot, but I have this feeling that there's not enough in the foreground to make it interesting. So the second shot is going to be really similar. It's almost identical, but I'm going to drop the camera as low to the ground as I can get it while still on the tripod and try and include some of the cliffside foliage in the actual shot. Now, obviously, there are going to be a little bit of depth of field choices to make, so I can either have hyperfocal and use some crazy aperture f22 and see what I can get. What I think I'm likely to do is accept that I'm going to lose a little bit of the foreground. I'm going to shoot to have the background in focus, and you're just going to get the kind of outlines and shape of what was in front of the camera. So I've set up for my lower down shot and I've remetered it. I'm not sure why, because the light is pretty stable, pretty unchanging. I don't expect that I'm going to get more than a stop of light change in the 2 hours I'm here. I'm going to take this shot now. I've actually elected to shoot at f22 and really try and maximize my depth of field. I'm using a 50mm lens on a 6x6. It's the 50mm f4, but it's although it sounds like a standard, it's actually pretty wide. It's about equivalent to a 28mm. So if I really whack up the aperture, I should be able to get a crisp foreground and a relatively crisp background, or vice versa. I'm going to put the depth of preview lever on, peek through the viewfinder a few times. With my light meter, if I do take the F number up to 22, I think that I'm going to get exposure time of around 1/4 of a second. So I'm glad that I've got it on this stable, very wide tripod. If I just duck out the way, you might be able to see it. And what I'll do is I'll try and get those two as quickly as I can next to each other. See if I can get a nice bit of foreground interest with a little caterpillar as well, who's, I wouldn't say he's walked into my frame. He's been there since the start. I mean, if anything, I'm the one disturbing him, but that might add a little bit of flair to it. I don't know.
There you go, close up of the model for the next shot. I think this shot works better than the first one because that addition of the foreground does just give a little bit of counterbalance to the weight the sky has. Now you can see that film B is a little bit punchier when it comes to the blacks, and it does seem to have a little bit more contrast. It's particularly noticeable in the bottom right, the very corner of the frame, but also just in any of the rocks you can see that when it does drop into shadow, it drops there a little bit harsher on the right hand film.
It's a bit of a shame that I'm doing specifically a black and white video today, because if you look at the colour of the water down here, it has this amazing shade of turquoise. If I just give you a little bit of neutral density, perhaps you can see it better. Although it's winter and no doubt that water is about 7 or 8 degrees warm, it does look quite inviting. I have got some Provia with me, but maybe that's for another day. So this is going to be a similar composition to last time, but instead of facing east up the coast, I'm facing west down the coast. Actually, where I was for the last image is actually going to be in this picture. I don't know if you can see it on the video camera, but just where that breakaway rock is, the cliff above it, that's where I took my first 2 shots. So the third is kind of the opposite shot. It's going to cross over. It's going to have this cliff in the jumping out from the land with that rock that comes down, and then it's going to stretch off into the sea. But one thing I liked from the second shot was this idea that the foreground kind of bleeds into it. So if you can see just in front of me here, I have this little bit of spongy, I think it's heather, and it has, I mean, they're dead little flowers, but in black and white they'll look like they might be alive. So I'm going to have those coming around the bottom left side of the frame and kind of framing the rock as it goes out into the sea. To be honest, if I had access to a cherry picker, I'd put myself kind of in that way a bit and a little bit further down so that I could really accentuate the rock stretching out, but I'm working with what I have with me, and I'm also working with what is safe, and this is about as close as I want to go to the edge here, especially given that I don't know what's underneath and it's likely to be, I mean, yeah, death. Let's crack on. I have these seabirds as well. Again, I don't know if you can see them, but they're playing in the winds. The current, obviously, as the wind hits the cliff, I think gives them a bit of a boost. So they kind of go into it and they come up. Hang on, stuff's going to start falling over. But that's something that I'm going to try and do as well. I mean, yeah, hopefully this video makes it to YouTube and I don't end up in the news under a cliff. One thing I find when you're working somewhere that has limited space and you have like an awkward tripod like this, it's actually much easier if you take the camera off and just hand hold it, move the camera around till you find exactly where you want it to go, and then just think of that spot, and often where the tripod will go kind of falls into place. It's a three-way head. I'm using it because it's very stable, but it is not an ideal way to compose, especially with the reverse thing. Every time you wind it one way, the screen moves the other. I'm just going to lift this up and put this behind me, and now I'm just going to do it freehand. Okay, so around here is my ideal tripod position. So that would have taken me ages to work out. But with this, what I can do is I can put this on. I'm going to bring up the stem, sacrificing a little bit of stability for ease of use. Okay, I don't know how much of that you heard, but that has saved me time. I've now got my tripod set. What I'm going to do is shoot whatever back's on it. It's got the delta back on it, so I'll meter, shoot the delta. Again, I'm going to be a bit funny with the depth of field, try and maximize it, just hyperfocal, trying to get as much out, and try and get that little bit of rock on the foreground to be sharp in focus. I think because last time I prioritized the background, this time I'm going to prioritize the foreground, so I'm going to meter whatever F22 gives me in seconds and try and apply that to both films despite the slightly different speeds, and we'll see what we get.
So I tried to get my foreground and background sharply in focus. Didn't quite get the foreground, but it sort of works. Obviously that horizon is a little bit wonky. I didn't crop any of these, I kept them all as the full negative. Now this is going to be your last chance to guess which film is which. So next time the picture comes up, I will be revealing it. But I think it's pretty obvious that film B is a little bit more contrasty, and that film A is just a little bit lighter and airier throughout, especially if you look in the swirling sea at the bottom right where the foam's on the surface of the water.
Okay, great. I can move away from the cliff as well. Right. Time to find a new competition then, I guess. I just dropped my, well, I didn't drop it, the wind dropped it. The wind just knocked over my video camera and my front filter took the most of it. It's got a bit of grass on the lens, which isn't really the look I'm going for. So I'm just gonna take a little break, fix this, and you know, I'm just sort of done with the wonky tripods. I might put the legs out a bit wider next time. Whoa, see, almost went again. Okay, so I've had another idea for a shot. I'm just up on the cliff and I'm watching the waves come in, and I just saw, whilst I was packing up from the previous one, this really straight series or set of waves come in. And I was thinking what I could do with this square format is just try and get them as evenly spaced and as geometrically kind of equidistant as possible. So imagine the frame obviously is a square, so I could have 4 horizontal lines or 3 horizontal lines, and then obviously the straight lines of the waves are interrupted by the chaos of the water. It's all kind of swirling. There's sea foam, there's undersea rocks that are kind of interrupting the breaking waves, and obviously it foams up around the submerged rocks. So what I'm going to do is set the camera up pointing at a nice clean bit of water and just wait for something nice and I guess visually pleasing to fill that frame, and I'll take that as my shot. I anticipate this big one I wait a little bit longer for, but I think that it is a potential shot. It is worth going for. I've switched to the 80mm. I know it's at a wacky angle, but I've got a slightly more narrower field of view, and I think that'll make composing it to the lines of the waves a little bit easier. There's no point trying to talk now because you're not going to hear anything. It's just pretty crazy on the cliff.
So I didn't really get the shot I was going for, but I got something. I much prefer the left-hand shot just because the way I timed it, that rock's visible and you can kind of see the faces of more of the waves. The right hand one is just a little bit messy. Yeah, I should reveal the films. The right hand one has been Delta, and the left hand one is the Fp4, so I'll change those name tags. And if you didn't get it right, the big clue was the fact that all of the Fp4 shots are brighter because it's a little bit faster than Delta.
Not 100% sure how my last shot came out. I waited a bit for that straight kind of set of waves, but the wind was making it so chaotic. I think that one I saw might have been the only one today, so I took 2 shots just because I'd set everything up. I thought that I had this sight down onto the water below. I'm not sure it's the best. It was way too windy to even start getting the video camera out, so what I did is I just walked down the coast. I think I've only walked maybe 500 meters, maybe less. I just walked up to the coastal path and then kept going down. And what I thought as I walked was that whilst I have this kind of chaotic sea but these still rocks, I could do a long exposure, so the water will all blur out into that kind of misty, icy single plane, and whilst doing that I could look at the reciprocity characteristics of both films and see which of them is more suited and which of them retains more detail. I've found this wall which has let me get out of the wind, and I don't know if I keep going that way whether I'm going to be able to do much more talking, so this is me signing off, maybe until after long exposures.
I can't talk too much about reciprocity because this video is already about half an hour long, but if you are interested in that, then leave a comment. I can do a standalone video about it. Interestingly, because it's older, you'd expect the more modern one to perform better, but it's actually the Fp4 that has a slightly better reciprocity characteristic. This shot is one of the only ones that emitted completely individually for both of the images. The reason being that because the exposure time for this was around the 3-minute mark, I was holding the bulb down, it was just my finger, so I could do both of them for the exact time they needed. Off the top of my head, I think that the Fp4 shot was around 3 minutes and 5 seconds, and the Delta shot was just over 3.5 minutes. So not a big difference, but a little difference, and that's definitely a win for the Fp4. After the first shot, I had this thought of underexposing the long exposure by 1 stop to get really dark rocks, but to retain a bit of detail and have more midtones in the sea. Now, these 2 shots I feel are vastly superior to the correctly exposed, and that correctly is in air quotes, obviously, it's where I choose to put it. But I think that these give a little bit more drama and a little bit more, I don't know, intrigue to the scene. There's much less detail in the foreground, but that little bit of grass and that little bit of cliff aren't really what the image is about. It is about the kind of sea swell and the way it's come out here. I'm quite happy with.
I've walked on a bit and it's just started to rain. The weather forecast said it would begin to rain a little bit around now, but what I'm worried about is the rain getting worse as I get further from the car. So my plan is to just hang around and kind of gauge whether it's going to be a rainstorm or just a little shower. This coat I'm wearing isn't actually waterproof, so if I do decide that it's downpour level, I'm just gonna duck out, run to the car, finish the video tomorrow. It's not so bad now. I mean, I don't know if you can even really see it, but I think that I'm gonna take this opportunity to do one test that's a little bit more, I guess, sort of structured, scientific. I'm gonna take a shot of this red phone box, and what we're going to do is we're going to use that to judge the sharpness of the 2 films. So I'm going to take both shots on a tripod, mirror up, shutter cable, f8, 80mm planar. So the only thing different in these 2 shots is going to be the film. I'll scan them the same, I'll use the same chemistry, and hopefully that gives you a pretty good indication of whether one of them is sharper than the other. Obviously, I think most people expect the Delta to have the edge here, but I want to show you how much of an edge there is. So let me just set the tripod up and yeah, let's see which one wins. I'm not sure why I used the word scientific. This isn't very scientific at all. I've got my camera set, I've focused the lens, I've actually closed the viewfinder, because if you get ground glass wet, it does this weird smearing thing. What I'm going to do is just get my light meter out. So let's just take a reading here. Okay, let's see what that gives me at f8. So that's 1/30th of a second at f8.5. So let's do f8.5. Oh, actually it's a sharpness test, so let's keep the aperture fixed. Okay, so we're going to do f8.5 for both, and let's see what we get with that.
So I kept everything locked off, sturdy, and these should be pretty sharp shots. You can see that the Fp4 is a little bit brighter, but the reason for that is that I didn't want to change any of the camera settings. Let's have a look at a zoomed in 1:1 crop. You can see that the rust on the door side of the lock is a little bit darker, but the amount of detail isn't vastly different. One area you can see the grain most clearly is in the white stripe on the left side of the frame. Now the grain's a lot more noticeable on the Fp4, but that's not just because the amount of grain, but also the shape of the grain. It's more granular, and it's like a kind of fine scattering of sand over the negative or whatever. On the right you can see that that white stripe looks a little bit cleaner on the way down, and that's because the Delta grain just seems a bit flatter. It's more like sort of little circles than it is little dots. But just pause the video and you can examine this. Maybe set the YouTube settings to 1080p and you can have a real look at it.
So I'm back home. It got dark quite quickly. I actually, it wasn't really raining, it was more sea spray being blown up the cliff by the wind. I noticed, because it was on the lens barrel, I kind of touched it, licked my finger, and when you know it's salt, you know that one, it's really bad for all the kit, and two, if you go a little bit further inland, you should be alright. When I got back, I thought I got a couple of frames left on both rolls, and it'd be a shame to do something that isn't part of the review, seeing as I am trying to compare them so identically. So I just set up the little color checker, and I took that on both. The idea there is that we can see if one of them has an increased dynamic range, or if one of them reacts to different colors. For example, one might lighten reds, darken reds. I don't really know what to expect, so what I'll do is I'll put those side by side, very close together, and you can kind of do a one-to-one comparison. Perhaps I'll also put a color picture of what a color checker just looks like under normal light.
What strikes me about this is just how similar they are. I think that I can see a little bit more color differentiation in Delta, but I have no confidence in saying that. If you look at the color checker, you can see which colors correspond to which squares, but there's really not much in it. I don't think that you'd be choosing between these films purely based off their ability to render different colors. They're both pretty similar in what they do.
So I hope that seeing them side by side like that helped you make up your mind. I went into it expecting to prefer Delta, but I actually side with Fp4 for most things. Obviously, the look that you get out of the film can be adjusted, and for this video, I didn't do any of that stuff so that it was a fair comparison. But a few times it looked like Delta had lost shadow detail. I actually have the negatives here, and I've looked at them with a loupe on a light table. And they're about the same. I think that there is a little bit more inherent contrast in Delta. It just has a little bit more punch to it. But if you add contrast, it's very easy, but removing contrast is much more difficult. So I think that settling on the film that you prefer as its sort of box speed untouched is probably a better starting point. The next thing is that although I tried to make it as equal and fair as possible, I think there might have been a bias in the chemistry used towards Fp4. I used HC110, 1+31 dilution, if you're into that kind of stuff. And I think that because there are developers that are suited to T-grain, that maybe if you are a kind of Delta fan, that looking in that direction might suit you better. In fact, just interestingly, the Fp4 actually took 9 minutes to develop, same temperature, same dilution, whereas the Delta took 6 minutes in exactly the same chemistry. So that gives you a little insight into the slightly different emulsions. Another thing to note is that I didn't use any color filters. The main reason being, if I was to shoot color filters, it wouldn't really be a a sort of a comparison between the films. It would be a comparison between the way the films react to color filters. I'd also need an extra 2 film backs, and it would have just been really chaotic if I was to try and fit that all into one. It's interesting because I have shot these rather flat, but obviously dodging and burning, a little bit of Photoshop, and I will sort these out. I think I'll probably post one as I would edit it. Obviously there'll be a little bit of adjustment to it. I'll probably put it in a 4:3 crop, and you'll be able to find that on my Instagram. But as they come out, I mean, these negatives have a huge amount of range. There's so much to work in. I'd struggle to tell them apart. I know that this is Fp4 because I accidentally wound on a frame and missed one here. But if you, took one strip and they are so identical and held it, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one's which. So I guess the conclusion, if there is one, is that these films are incredibly similar. With regard to the grain, I think that if you like grain, then you're gonna like Fp4. And if you're trying to take steps to minimize grain, I think that Delta will suit you better. It's almost as if Fp4 is more suited to an optical printing workflow. If you're using an enlarger and you go for the classic look, then this might suit you better. If you're putting it through a computer, if you're printing it with an inkjet, that kind of stuff, maybe Delta's the way to go. Obviously, I haven't printed either of these. I'm not sure I will, but if I do, maybe I'll update you. I guess my next video is just going to be talking about shooting a Hasselblad 500 series. Last video, or this video, I was just a bit busy and didn't really talk about how they are to use, but that could be interesting. I think that that's a little bit more mass market appeal than a really niche look at 2 films. And the other one I'm excited to do is Ortho 80, which is Ilford's new orthochromatic. It sort of has no red sensitivity, which is kind of weird. It's, to my mind, equivalent to having a blue filter permanently screwed on, but that will be fun, and also it's quite new, so I have never shot it and I haven't really seen anyone who has yet, and I'm planning to do some of that. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching.